Hello, Neil. I'm back in New York, and you're still in LA.
That's right. Good to see you.
Okay, in a house that has recently had things done to it that we're not even going to mention because
No.
no, nobody wants to hear those things. Gosh, it's been a busy week for me. I gave a talk at Sarah Lawrence on Wednesday night about the election. And I have to say, it made me so glad I was retired on the one hand, and so happy to be back on a liberal arts campus talking to smart kids.
That's
you
awesome.
know, yeah. I mean, do you ever get that when you're going around giving your talks and so on? And, it's just like, yeah, it's great not to have the responsibility of teaching, but having those bright young people asking important questions is so inspiring.
Yeah, to be on a campus and it not involve you grading or assessing students is the ideal scenario. Speaking of that, I'm
It,
actually going to be at Vanderbilt in a week and a half. I'm giving a talk on October 22nd. Actually, I'll be in conversation with Nicole Himmer October 22nd at Vanderbilt from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. talking about LGBTQ voters in the 2024 election. So if there are Nashville folks out there watching this, please come by.
that's fantastic. So, Vandy fans, and didn't Vanderbilt just have like a big football victory?
One of the biggest ever in history. They upset
Yeah,
number one Alabama at home. It was amazing.
it pleased me so much. I mean, you and I last saw each other in person at Vanderbilt, and I really
That's right.
loved the campus, and it's a really gracious place. And the idea that Vanderbilt knocked off Alabama is just, it's like some kind of karmic justice, right?
Absolutely. I'm not sure if we're cheering for upsets this year, but definitely in football.
Definitely in football, yes. So 24 days to the election, and we're not going to go through the polls because they are always the same. But Nate Silver is giving Kamala Harris a 55% probability of winning the race, which isn't everything, but it's something. And I thought it was significant that on the right, my friend Ryan Jerdusky, who is a political strategist for Republican candidates and has a big newsletter called the National Populist Newsletter, seemed to be asking his readers to prepare themselves for a Trump loss. And he's not saying Trump is going to lose, but he's beginning to present data that looks like Trump has maybe kind of gotten stuck at a certain number, despite significant Republican gains, even in blue states. And Ryan also said something kind of interesting, which I just want to stick in here, which is that Republicans have started clustering together. And that's a problem when you're a minority party in terms of, numerical figures, because they're developing what he calls these Republican sinks. For example, in the state of Florida, that Republican voters clustered to Florida, and that has a huge effect on Florida, but it actually takes those voters away from
Yeah.
northeastern states. What do you think about that, Neil?
I mean, I think that that's a fast. I hadn't heard that terminology. I really like that as a concept or a framing, a phrase to understand what I think is a phenomenon a lot of us have been observing for a while. I don't know what a party does. Obviously, it can't stop people from moving places and living their lives,
Right.
but um, it'll be interesting to see how the Republican Party handles that on the ground going forward. If there's any sense of increasing voter registration in places where they've really seen their base like move out of, or if they just
Right.
really hunkered down in sort of a minority status and operate from there. They can obviously do a lot of damage, or they can have a lot of success locally and at the state level. But I assume this party wants to still shape national policy, and it'll be interesting to see if they're able to do that if voters become so cloistered geographically.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And obviously, it contributes to the larger picture of geographic polarization to have that happen, which is not good for democracy at all. Now, on the bright news for Democrats side, Inside Higher Ed has Kamala Harris ahead among students by a whopping 38 points. And this is not something I would have predicted after the campus protests of last spring, which students are still kind of bitter and fragile about, or at least the students that were involved. And Inside Higher Ed has an even slightly higher margin for students in swing states. 1/3 of respondents to the poll said that they are actually voting as opposed to not voting because Kamala Harris is on the ticket. What do
Mm.
you think?
I think that's really profound. It's interesting because I've just bringing in other polling here. It's like you add college degree into any demographic you're talking about.
Right.
And what I've seen is almost in all of those demographics, there's a 30% difference between, whether they're talking about white men who went to college or didn't, college voter or college graduates versus non-college
Right.
graduates, church attenders who with a college degree versus, almost every single one of these demographics has some 25 to 30 plus percent difference
Yeah.
that hinges on that college degree, which is fascinating.
Yeah, it is fascinating. And, one of the things I've noticed, because as you know, Neil, I spend my Thursday nights and sometimes Wednesday nights with the Elizabeth Warren team, which has been turned over to the Harris campaign. And last night I was calling into Georgia,
Hmm.
which was really interesting. And it, basically peaks and valleys. Like the one woman I talked to said not only was she voting for Harris, but she was taking 10 members of her family to the polls with her.
Wow.
Um, yeah, which is cool. And then I actually talked to a lot of men, and I think I was hitting that demographic of Black men who are supporting Trump. And they would say, "Oh, no, I'm supporting Donald Trump." And I would say, "Can you tell me why?" And they would say, "Well, because he's strong." And I'd say, "Well, how do you know he's strong? In what ways is he strong? And what policies signal strength to you?" And they wouldn't really answer the question. They would say, "Well, he's strong." Or they would say, "I don't think Kamala Harris will be respected by world leaders." And I would say, "Well, why do you think that?" And they didn't have an answer. And it made it somewhat evident to me that one thing somebody should be looking into is the power of media images for people who don't have access to a lot of information or aren't habitually, um, you know, thinking critically about a range of political issues. I mean, these are people who obviously weren't stupid,
Right.
but they couldn't explain why they believed what they believed, and they were perfectly friendly. It's not like it was hostile.
Hmm. Hmm.
What do you think about that, Neil? Has media image sort of taken over the role of information in voting?
I mean, I think that's a huge factor for so many voters in our fractured media environment. And when people are actually getting more of their messaging, and a lot of that is image based in these social media spaces, I think it's really particularly fascinating to hear the comment about perceiving Trump as the stronger, or the one who would be perceived by other world leaders as the stronger
Right.
president, when we know actually that he's the laughing stock of all world leaders and he's the puppet of the worst. So that's very concerning. But,
Right.
Obama was in Pittsburgh last night, and I don't know if you saw his talk, but he was addressing Black men directly. And I thought it was really
Right.
interesting and basically saying, come on, guys, in a way that I think, obviously he was really suited to deliver this message. you know, there's nothing impressive about backing away from supporting a black woman and a black
Right.
woman. And he said, black women have always had our backs. It's time for us to have this woman's back. And I imagine that that's a message that's going to be repeated, over and over up until election day, because this is a demographic that Harris cannot afford, um, to see her numbers slip there.
Yeah, I agree. And since you brought up Pennsylvania, I want to say that my mother voted by mail for the first time this week. She's 91 and she's a very vigorous 91, but she was really afraid that if there was bad weather, she might not make it to the polls, or if there was an ice storm, or if her car broke down, and she was determined to cast her ballot. In 2016, she was very disappointed because she said she'd wanted to see the first woman president in her lifetime. And I was like,
Mhm.
Mom, you got another chance. So she voted by mail. Now, the good news about mail in ballots in Pennsylvania is that Republican organizers are frantically trying to catch up with Democrats on mail in voting. At last count in that state, Democrats had requested twice as many mail in ballots, even though the GOP has plugged more than $10 million into organizing this, according to the New York Times. Over 2 million absentee ballots have been mailed in Michigan by the end of September. And I think we should talk a little bit, maybe just for 2 seconds, about why Republicans dislike mail in ballots, which, by the way, are rejected at a much higher rate than
Mm.
in person ballots. There are a lot more opportunities to make a mistake with your mail in ballot, and some of them can be cured and some of them can't be cured. Um, but, you know, why don't Republicans like mail in voting, Neil?
Well, I don't feel like I've ever actually seen a good argument or a good explanation for why there is this huge cultural or maybe it's a political divide between, Republicans choosing to vote in person day of and Democrats voting by such a disproportionate amount via other means, especially by mail. I do think there might be a sort of, if your cultural or if your political conservatism is one in which you distrust the government and you distrust so many operations of it, that something like mail-in ballots feels new and feels like it's less
Right.
trustworthy and it's not the way it's always been done, as if we've always voted in the way we have. That there's a sort of like traditional list perspective that comes into this.
Right.
But also, like, conservative media has spent a lot of messaging over the last, I would say, almost a decade now, telling Republican voters to vote only in person day of election.
Right.
So, I think that's shaping these patterns as well.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. And the truth is that we have done so little to help people vote in this country. We don't give workers the day off to vote. We don't, in many states, have a long period of voting. In some states we do, but in many states we don't. Some countries vote on a Sunday. But actually, Republicans don't like that either because it used to be that Black churches would organize people to vote. And of course, if you've got the whole congregation there on Sunday, you just walk them down to the polls. So Republicans have over time been invested in fewer people voting. And of course, when that happens, Republicans tend to win. So they've cut themselves into a really bad place here where they've raised all of these doubts about mail-in voting, but actually you need those mail-in votes to win an election. So Neil, let's shift to the topic for today, which is Kamala Harris's media strategy, which has really taken off this week with a media blitz on a variety of shows and podcasts and different kinds of hosts. And I guess I want to talk today about the media itself, what it is that we've seen in these shows, but then also take a look at the coverage of the coverage, because media is such a self referential field. Um, so, Neil, large outlets have been fuming about Harris not paying more attention to them. But why is she more interested in being on a podcast, say, than, an interview with Leslie Stahl?
Well, I think that there's a sense that media has shifted so much, and that sort of hitting the stations of the cross, if you will, of the sort of prior media model of the New York Times sit down, of the Leslie Stahl sit down, of the long session with a CNN anchor, that just isn't reaching voters in the way that it used to, and particularly it's not reaching the groups that she needs to activate. And
Right.
so I think it's been really smart. the directions the Harris campaign has gone. And I think it's worth pointing out that in a lot of ways, Trump is mimicking that. I mean, he also is on the podcast circuit. He obviously operates very much in the social media sphere. I think this over analysis of Harris and her decision making around media involvement speaks to the sort of general asymmetry with which both of these candidates are constantly treated by national media.
That's really interesting. And, the Wall Street Journal referred to the media environment as fragmented, but actually it's a kind of pinpointing of demographics, which I
Mm.
talked a little bit
Hmm.
about in my book, Political Junkies. And that really goes to work on the national level in 2008 when the Obama campaign starts using Facebook. And of course, social media companies and podcasters and radio stations and so on, they actually craft their product for a demographic. So, in a sense, they're doing the kind of work that a political campaign used to do. And so that general message to a general voter
Right.
can actually seem kind of incoherent by
Hmm.
comparison, right?
Absolutely. And when national media is telling us over and over again something we already know, that this election is really going to be won in probably a handful of districts by a couple of thousand voters, I mean, that I think serves to undercut any sort of urgency around doing national messaging, national media spots. I mean, you pointed out a couple of weeks ago, I think, about some sit down that Harris had done in a Pennsylvania radio station, right? And like
Hmm.
this recognition that that is a district, a region I have to really hit hard. And also, when I do that sit down interview, national media is going to pick it up anyway. But I think it's that targeted reach out to voters who really matter in a very close election that works especially well as media continues to fragment and have more and more options for a candidate to really pinpoint their messaging and just even their where they show up.
Yeah, I think that's right. And the Baltimore Banner had a great phrase for this. Some outlets have been saying, well, Harris is avoiding the mainstream media. The Baltimore Banner said, well, she's actually working around the mainstream media. And the Banner thought this was actually kind of a brilliant strategy. And you're right about those handfuls of votes, and they have particular characteristics. I think what's also interesting is that Donald Trump has also increasingly pulled back from the mainstream media.
Exactly.
He's declined to participate in another CNN debate. Well, the network sort of pushed back and said, well, then we're going to have Kamala Harris take part in a town hall on October 23rd, which is like 10 days before the election. The town hall will take place in Pennsylvania. And I think the Trump campaign, on the one hand, has nothing to gain by making that contrast again. I mean, the contrast is so obviously to Trump's detriment. On the other hand, they have created an opportunity for Harris to step into a statesmanlike role on a broader media channel, right?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's smart to take up that opportunity, and a town hall seems like one where she could do really well, right? And not having to, I don't know, I mean, she obviously did incredibly in facing off against Trump. But I
Right.
think there's something about the town hall that has often benefited, I think, candidates really across the board to sort of
Right.
present the best image of themselves. Now, I think
Right.
this whole discourse of avoiding the media reveals a lot of assumptions that are built into
Yeah.
traditional media's political analysis, which is that they are the gatekeepers of this process, that they are the sort of ones who ask the hard questions, and that these new media outlets, that those are softer formats and those are softer places. And
Right.
I think we've seen some examples of that, like Harris's Call Her Daddy interview. I would not say was
Hmm.
hard hitting. I mean, that's a friendly format. But I was impressed by the level of detail with which she got to a lot of policy questions with Howard Stern.
Right.
Um, and I actually wasn't all that impressed with the 60 Minutes interview. Not from her standpoint, but from the interviewer, whose name I'm blanking on
Right.
right now. But in watching it and also in reading the transcript, I thought it was actually a lot lighter than it's being regarded. And I think, again, there's just a built-in bias to these like traditional media platforms, that these are serious places, that these are the hard-hitting places, and that others are not serious, others are not hard-hitting. And I don't know that the evidence actually shows that to be the case.
Yeah, and I agree with you. It also shows certain kinds of assumptions about what information voters really want.
Right.
So, the 60 Minutes interview, one of the things that was annoying about it is that questions were asked from a certain assumption about Harris already that were
Exactly.
often wrong. And she would
Hmm.
correct them and say, no, actually, that's not right. And then she would say something else. Certain questions were asked for sensationalism. You say you own a gun. What kind of gun is it? It's a Glock. Have you ever shot it? Like, really?
You would ask that of a white man who says they own a gun? I mean, exactly.
Right, exactly. And what kind of a sentient person would own a gun that they actually didn't know how to use? I mean, I
Right.
imagine there are some of them out there, but even the gun owners who you and I don't really want to be neighbors with spend a lot of time at the range, making sure that they could hit something bigger than an elephant with it. Let's return to the daddy gang, as they're called. That's another kind of information. Harris was able to convey a kind of emotional intelligence, but also a deep knowledge about what women are facing when they are facing limitations on their reproductive rights, correct?
Yes, and I think that, it made sense that that was the message she really, I mean, she's focusing on that message a lot in general in her campaign, but I think it makes a ton of sense that on a podcast like this where millions of young women listen to it. I mean, it's the second biggest podcast on Spotify behind Joe Rogan, I believe, is the
Right.
data around that. I mean, and it has a young listenership that may not be all that engaged in this election. That's a smart message to take to them. But I also think, just to tie that interview back to the 60 Minutes one, I mean, I feel bad that I'm blanking on his name, but the 60 Minutes interviewer kept hammering her on like not being well known, and that the American people didn't really trust her because they didn't know her that well and they weren't really sure who she is. A Call Her Daddy appearance or a Late Night with, Colbert appearance is all about allowing voters to know her more, to sort of present herself as a person, as someone that people can, relate to and trust and perhaps even like. And so it feels a little bit like, again, um, unfair in a way to sort of
Mhm.
criticize her for not being well known or well understood, and then going on these other platforms where that is actually the intention of the appearance.
Yeah, I agree with you. And Neil, I just looked it up. The interviewer on 60 Minutes was Bill Whitaker,
Thank you.
which
I knew it
just
started with a
shows
W.
how
It's driving me crazy.
well, it just shows how little you and I watch CBS is actually what it proves. But yeah, and I think the blowback on call, what is it called? Call
Call
Your
her daddy.
Daddy.
Call her
Call
daddy.
Her Daddy. Call Her Daddy. The blowback against the show, that show has marketed itself as nonpartisan and as not particularly political. And she gave a whole, now I'm blanking on her name, but she gave a whole speech at the beginning saying, I don't normally do politics on this show, and there's a reason for that. But this election is so important. I'm breaking my rule. And apparently, a lot of her listeners were really distressed about it.
I'm sure. I think it was a big risk on her part, because that's not what her show is about at all. They come on there to
Right.
talk about like hookup culture and makeup and celebrity gossip. And she has been known to bring, I think, more substantive guests on here and there. But obviously, a choice like this, is going to irritate a chunk of your listenership.
Right.
And I think it's also about the sort of the intimacy and the relationship that's really at the heart of podcast, right? Like that people
Right.
believe that those podcast hosts are their friends in a way that's like, um, not how they regard like a CNN anchor, and also a sort of
Right.
real different expectation of what these different places are going to be. But I think, obviously it's to her credit, I think, for her to have brought Harris on. Completely start smart strategy on the Harris team for making that happen as well.
Yeah. So I want to go back to the Colbert interview a little bit because Colbert occupies this position of being very serious and very not serious and using comedy as critique. I am not a big watcher of Stephen Colbert, so this is the first time I've seen his show in dog's years. And I was so impressed by it. But there's this great moment where he uses the 60 Minutes clip at the beginning of the Harris interview saying, "We invited Donald Trump and he said he would do it, but then he said he wouldn't do it." And they sort of pantsed him on air in this very uptight white man way. And then Colbert comes on and says, you know, Donald Trump didn't accept the invitation, blah, blah, blah. So we told him to go fuck himself.
Hmm.
And I thought that, I mean, it's such a commentary on how the media should be handling this campaign. But then when Harris came on, among other things, Stephen Colbert very publicly had a beer with her.
Right.
What did you think of that interview?
Well, you know what? I thought it actually found it sort of, I mean, I love the beer moment, and
Hmm.
they, very pointedly were drinking a beer from Milwaukee, since Wisconsin is a
Right.
state that really matters here in this election. I found it actually one of her more uneven performances.
Hmm.
Now it's late night. I don't think we should make a big deal of it, but this question about like, what do you love about America? Do you remember how she
Yeah.
sort of just stumbled her way through it?
Right.
Um, and of course, the conservative folks on Twitter had a field day with that clip.
Right.
Um, but to me, I really was way more impressed and moved by, and really found myself rewatching the Howard Stern interview,
Right.
because I thought that had this really compelling mix of like some hard policy stuff. Like she was very forceful on Ukraine and on and on foreign policy issues, and really in attacking Trump on that front, but also
Right.
really giving us a sense of who she is and things that motivate her, and why she's involved in politics and just who she is as a person. Obviously, a Howard Stern interview is a lot more time than like a brief sort of segment on Colbert. But Colbert was not my favorite appearance. What did you think
Right.
of it?
It wasn't my favorite appearance either, in part because it seemed very staged. I mean, the
Hmm.
audience was clearly full of Harris fans, so there were these huge explosions of cheering. I felt like Harris and Colbert connected, but in this very, very formal way. I want to speak briefly to the Howard Stern show, which struck me as different in part because Howard Stern started his career as a radio shock jock.
Yeah.
And it was people like Howard Stern that actually drove the populist MAGA mentality, right? It wasn't just Rush Limbaugh. It was people like Howard Stern who, very famously said crude and racist things about the Rutgers women's basketball team
Yeah.
when they won the national championship. I've always hated Howard Stern. So that interview seemed to me like more of an inflection point than the Colbert interview. One would expect Colbert to have Kamala Harris on, but for Howard Stern to have her on was like opening a big space for the angry white men to take another look, I thought.
Absolutely. And I thought, okay, who does the Colbert appearance move the needle with? Like, probably nobody. I mean, maybe there's a few voters out there that like weren't really sure whether or not they were going to go to the polls, and they saw her on Colbert and they just got that, like, pushed them over
Right.
the line to do so. Whereas, you can imagine a large listenership Howard Stern's, I mean, I imagine a lot of people turned off, the
Right.
program and didn't want to, but there has to be an enormous part of his listenership that isn't inclined to vote for Harris, and that might be motivated to do so because of this exchange. And I think that's a really smart point you made about the sort of cultural transformation that Howard Stern
Right.
really drove. That does help
Mhm.
us think about the rise of a MAGA culture in this nation.
Yeah, yeah. Now, there's one other interview I want to take a look at, which was Kamala Harris's appearance on The View.
Mm.
Also a show I detest because it's just so gooey. It's like
Yeah.
this gooey female experience of everyone loves everybody, and we're all girls here together. And I don't know. I'm sure there's some complicated gender thing that I'm not really paying attention to here. But The View also annoys me because it was in part The View that introduced Donald Trump to a female middle class white audience in the first place. And it was a very famous appearance on The View that Trump's charges that Obama was not an American citizen first went national. Um, and I talk about this a little bit in Political Junkies. It's just a small part of the book. So I wish shows like The View were a little bit more self reflective about how they were piping stuff into the mainstream, but I actually thought Harris's appearance showed her at her best. She was clearly extremely comfortable with that group, and it allowed her to let her guard down a little bit and maybe see her as less the policymaker than an empathetic human being who will make hard decisions on behalf of the American people.
Yeah, she was really in her element there, and I think she felt very comfortable, very relaxed, like ready to yuck it up with the ladies. And I think she's so charming when you really see her humor at work and that great laugh of hers, and the way to sort of, I think, what a lot of sociologists and political scientists have talked about. Kitchen table politics. Like, I feel like there's a
Right,
way in which she sort of um, was really bringing that to life in that interview, right? Talking about elder care, talk about sort of the
right,
sandwich generation,
right,
and I think again, this is aimed at a almost entirely um, female audience watching that show,
right,
that is being pulled in both directions, that like, and
right.
is also the one that watches the family's pocketbook and those sorts of things, but also wants to relate, I think, to a potential leader like this. Yeah. Now that, of course, the View has that appearance has gotten, attacked a lot by the right because they hate that show to begin with. And of course, it was
Right.
sort of like a preaching to the choir moment. But I think it was a preaching
Right.
to the choir moment that allowed her to really position herself in ways that she isn't able to in a lot of these other spaces.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I also think that to come back to the question of fragmentation that we talked about earlier, it's really difficult for something like a national debate or a town hall or a 60 Minutes interview to treat subjects like foreign policy and elder care in the same space and have them come out equally. I mean, inevitably, elder care comes out as a women's issue, and foreign
Right.
policy is the thing you really want to hammer on. Whereas if you can actually dig into the experience of taking care of a mother, which is something I'm doing now, and it's a very unifying experience. Americans do it, whether they're Republicans or Democrats, and it's hard. And because we don't have a good state support system for the elderly, we're all reinventing the wheel every day. So that is actually the kind of topic that does bring us together and gives us something to talk about as a nation.
Hmm.
So, Neil, we haven't got much time left. Viewers, I'm going to give you links to all of these shows, including coverage of the shows, everything that Neil and I have been reading. But I want to spin now to what we want to go viral. And Neil, why don't you go first?
All right. This is a poll that came out that I want to talk about. It actually came out a couple weeks ago, but I've just been thinking about it a lot. And it's a poll that it's from The Advocate, a poll taken in late September. 74% of LGBTQ Americans plan to vote for Kamala Harris. Okay, so there's a couple of things that are interesting about this to me. I think if you told most political candidates that 74% of sort of any demographic group was planning to vote for them, with most demographic groups, you'd feel pretty happy about that. If you're a
Right.
Democratic candidate running for office, especially for the presidency, and you're polling at 74% with LGBTQ folks, that's not great. In fact, if
Hmm.
this number bears out, it would put Harris on the lower average, on the lower end of the average support Democratic presidential candidates have received from LGBTQ voters. So we have polling data that goes back to 1992. So 30 plus years now of election data for presidential races. And 74% would be on the lower end of what Democrats have received in these races. Now, that's interesting in itself, but I want to talk about what the other numbers showed. So right now, the polling is only giving, in this poll, only gave Trump 7.5% of the LGBTQ vote, which would be um, the lowest by far a Republican
Wow.
presidential candidate has ever gotten. The previous low is 14%, which was in 1992 when George H.W. Bush was running for reelection, and in 2016 when Trump faced off against Hillary Clinton. 14% both of those years, but 7.5% would be far, far below it. I don't imagine that that's actually going to be the number on election day. I think he'll be probably up there again in the low double digits. I think a lot of people don't want to say they're voting for Trump, and that includes LGBTQ voters. But what
Right.
I'm really interested in here are the almost 20% of voters who were polled in this survey who said they were either voting for a third party candidate or they didn't intend to vote in this election.
Wow.
20% of LGBTQ voters right now are saying they're either voting for a third party candidate or they're staying home. And one of the things that came up in this poll that I think is two things I think are driving that. One is Gaza, right? Obviously, that's
Right.
shaping, I think, those who are choosing third party candidates, as it is with any demographic that's choosing third party candidates. Gaza is a big part of that. But the thing that came up in this poll that's significant was a lot of these voters were saying, they think that they were downplaying LGBTQ issues in this election
Hmm.
and even indicating that they thought we were in sort of a post LGBTQ rights era of history. And as someone who's written a book about LGBTQ conservatives, that has long been an argument that gay
Hmm.
Republicans have made, right? We've achieved gay rights, like we don't need to worry about it anymore. To see that that might be a mindset that's emerging on left of center LGBTQ voters, I think is really profound. On one hand, that seems like progress. If LGBTQ Americans feel like, rights have been secured, this is no longer a contentious issue, that feels like progress. But given what we know is happening right now, and I think what is really shaping up as a primary issue of conservative activists, like going after the LGBTQ rights movement, it does make me worried that this large a number of LGBTQ voters do not think that LGBTQ rights are enough of an issue to motivate electoral decisions anymore, or at least in 2024. So we'll see how those numbers actually shape up when the
Yeah.
election actually happens. But this was some fascinating polling data to dive into.
Thank you so much for that, Neil. And I actually think we should devote a whole episode to it after the election when we actually see what
See what those
happened.
are. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, when I was talking to the young people at Sarah Lawrence on Wednesday night, one of the things I proposed to them was that identity politics, as it used to constitute the Democratic Party, may actually be in a full on collapse.
Yeah.
And that what we're seeing in the Republican Party, which is something you talk about in your book, is economic interests that are much more salient
Hmm.
for identity groups than ideas about prejudice or equality or so on. So
Hmm.
that's really interesting, Neil. Um, so what I want to go viral this week, which has been around for a while, but a lot of people may not have given it a look, is Ryan Holiday's Monsters on Netflix, which is about Lyle and Eric, the Menendez brothers, who brutally murdered their parents, Jose and Kitty, in 1989. Jose Menendez was a music executive who was also the person who promoted Menudo in this country. The Menendez brothers shot their parents many, many times with large guns. They were tried twice in 1993, which ended in a mistrial and was broadcast on court TV. And I remember I was on sabbatical at the time, so I would like work from like 9 until noon or 1 o'clock, and then I would turn on court TV and watch it. I was just obsessed with the Menendez brothers. And then in 1995, when they were convicted of first degree murder. But one of the things that came up in the trial, which has continued to interest people who think that the Menendez brothers got a raw deal, was that both brothers claimed to have been sexually abused by their father. They said that their mother knew about the abuse and did nothing about it, and that at a certain point they did not believe they could free themselves of this abuse without killing both of their parents. And at the time, of course, people didn't really talk that much about male on male sexual abuse, certainly not anything that was different from the sort of homophobic attacks on gay men. And the idea that men could be systematically sexually abused, either as children or as teenagers, was really, it wasn't talked about that much. And since then, of course, we have a much clearer view of this. And so advocates for the Menendez brothers have kept sort of working on their behalf. And there actually is a movement now that's attached to the release of this series, a sort of re-narration of this story that includes the sexual abuse, that the movement to get them out of prison because they're both serving life terms. Now, the episode that really made me think this is not just a good series, but a great series, was episode 5, in which Cooper Koch, who plays Eric Menendez, tells his lawyer, who I think is Jill Abramson, about the sexual abuse and how it started and how it evolved over time and his feelings about it. I think it's an episode that was basically done in one take.
Mm-hmm.
And it is so persuasive and emotionally so searing. I think Cooper Koch deserves an Emmy for it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, did you see it, Neil?
Yeah, we're about, I think there's 7, we're on episode 7 or 8. I mean, this is not a show that one can really binge. It is so dark and
Right.
we're sort of slowly watching it, but that is one of the greatest performances I think I've ever seen on television. Give him all the awards. I mean, it's a 36 minute, essentially a monologue with the
Right.
camera right on him. And it is unbelievable.
Right. And this show, and of course a clever television show can do this, as a novel can do it, makes a whole new argument
Hmm.
for their case, so that some of the things that were used against them, for example, that they went on a spending spree after their parents were dead, so they must have just wanted the money, that they did all kinds of things that didn't really fit with being sexually abused or traumatized. Of course, it all makes much better sense in 2024, now that sexual abuse more broadly, in part because of the Me Too movement, has become a topic of much more intelligent discussion. And we don't automatically blame the victims, or at least we know it's wrong to blame the victims. And we know that when people are sexually assaulted, they often behave in ways that serve to conceal what has
Hmm.
happened and conceal the trauma, which is why people then don't believe them when they come out. So, monsters, you begin by thinking it's Lyle and Eric who are the monsters.
Hmm.
And at least by halfway through season 5, you're pretty sure that they were not the monsters
Yeah.
in that family. So, Neil, I hate to say goodbye to you for another week, but I shall.
So long.
I know, I know. Well, maybe we can like have lunch over Zoom or something
Sounds
like
good.
that.
All
All right, my friend. Thanks for being on the
right.
show.
See you next time.